Welcome everyone to the meeting. So I'm going to be talking about climate change and sort of its interaction with capitalism and how we can actually fight climate change, basically. So to start off with, we've all heard a lot about climate change, but I think it's important to just start off by sort of the trajectory that we're currently on at the moment under the system of capitalism. So the IPCC, which is the UN sort of climate body, the climate tracking body, has set 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, basically that much global warming, as the absolute limit to prevent climate catastrophe. We are on course currently to smash through that within the next 5 to 20 years. We're also set to smash through the Paris Agreement's 2 degrees target a number of years after that. And then also after we pass 2 degrees, a tipping point will basically be reached where, because of less snow and ice on the ice caps, basically the Earth will be able to reflect less of the sunlight, and that will speed up global warming even faster. And also permafrost, bits of the ground that used to be permanently frozen, will melt and contribute even more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we could see at the end of this process, climate change compared to pre-industrial levels of up to 5 degrees Celsius, which would be absolutely catastrophic. We're starting to see the sort of effects of that now with sort of forest fires, extreme weather in parts of the world that didn't used to receive it, and in parts of the world that did, more regular massive hurricanes, for example, in America, habitat loss and loss of species all over the world, and ultimately what we'll see is large swathes of the world that become uninhabitable for humans, and we will see mass migration from equatorial regions, which will cause huge social instability. So obviously the prognosis is pretty grim at the moment, and so as a result, we've seen people basically start to make noise about this, start to fight for this. But the response from governments and the response from the ruling class has been lacking in every sense. So it's been known about for ages and ages, and it's only after this pressure has been starting to put on them that they've started to take action. But what is this action? This action is sort of summits, peace, sort of agreements, talks, a lot of words and promises basically, but no real action, no action that's actually going to prevent any of this from happening. And every year we see no substantial change in our trajectory. And so what this boils down to at the end of the day is capitalism is unable to solve this crisis. The laws of capitalism, the logic of capitalism, mean that this crisis is unsolvable in capitalism. The big reason, there are a few reasons, but a big one is production for profit. Under capitalism, things are only done if they are profitable. That's going to be annoying. So things like cheap green energy, right? Which is very, once you set up renewable energy stations, they just keep producing energy. They don't require much. They require maintenance, but it's not like oil where you constantly drilling oil out of the ground. Things like insulation, we saw with Insulate Britain, the call to insulate homes, because we just lose massive amounts of energy through people having poorly insulated homes. Even stuff like recycling is probably more, it's basically all of these things. To do all of these things would reduce profit. If people aren't wasting as much energy, they're going to buy less energy, and so you can make less money. If you're an energy company, you want people to waste as much energy as they possibly can. And additionally, with things like planned obsolescence, we see companies, and this has been happening for 100 years now. Companies shortening the lives of making their products less useful so that those products will break, and then people will have to buy new ones, which is leading to huge issues of waste, right? Especially when it comes to things that can't be recycled very easily. This is just it's completely wasteful because it's profitable, essentially. And also, as a result of this climate crisis, we see the limits of the nation state, essentially. So a Marxist analysis of what the state is, what the government is supposed to do, is defend, the role of the state rather, is to defend the interests of their own bourgeoisie, essentially. So, and since sort of capitalists basically from other parts of the world have opposing interests, it's basically impossible to come to a sort of agreement, one might say, about what to do, because the gain for one sphere of influence, for example, America, is a loss for Russia. Basically, it's so there can be no sort of international solidarity because these groups have opposing interests. And also, like when we talk about like the UN and things like this that are sort of in an ideal, or like not an ideal world, but they're sort of purported to have sort of international, like an international governing body that stands above nations, basically, and like this idea of international law, right? Like I think the Paris Agreement is internationally or like is legally binding. It's a legally binding agreement, but who is there to enforce that legally binding agreement? There is no power to enforce laws under capitalism that isn't the power of individual states, right, or groups of states. So if America has the largest military in the world and America breaks international law, there's no one there to prevent that, basically say that shouldn't be happening, or to enforce that international law. And then the other one is opposing class interests. So this is the ultimate one, is that ultimately at the end of the day, the capitalist class and the working class have opposing interests when it comes to this issue and a number of issues. When it comes to the issue of cheap renewable energy or insulating homes, again, this is just something that obviously we should do as the working class. This is something that obviously makes sense to do, but because of the material interests of the ruling class, it's in their interests to waste the products of society for profit. And additionally, like, climate change will affect the working class long before it affects anyone in the ruling class. Like, we see already, like, wealthy people sort of buying nice homes inland, high up on hills, essentially. No one's buying sort of bits of land that are going to be underwater in the next sort of 30 years. And because they have the ability to do that, whereas the working class don't. And so how do we fight climate change, basically? That's the question. How do we stop this from happening? And this movement, this climate change movement, has proposed a number of options, and I'm sort of just going to run through them and explain why that's sort of their pitfalls, essentially. So first of all, you have, and this is a very bourgeois sort of way of doing it, is to talk about, sorry, what is happening? It's to talk about sort of consumers and consumer choice, right? This idea that, like, if everyone just makes better environmentally conscious decisions, we're all in this together, and we can all sort of pull together and stop the climate change, use less energy, better options like that. And obviously this is a bit of a cruel joke in the sense that this idea that the reason we have global warming is because people are consuming too much, or that people are basically using too much energy, using too many resources. It's like there's millions of people in this country, in advanced capitalist countries, who are in fuel poverty, right? Who don't have access to the things that they need to live. This idea of, and what it boils down to is essentially a sort of greenwashing of austerity, of saying, and yeah, I'll talk about greenwashing, but basically austerity is basically saying we all need to, it's saying the working class needs to make sacrifices to pay for this crisis, and saying that the reason we need to do it is because we need to save the planet, when in reality it's because the capitalist class do not want to cut down on their profits. We also see greenwashing when it comes to consumer options that are supposedly more environmentally friendly, that aren't really, at the end of the day, they don't really make any substantial difference. But because basically the environmentally conscious has become a market for capitalists to exploit, and basically say people who are environmentally conscious are willing to pay more for stuff, and we can get more profit out of that. Now obviously, like, at the end of the day, there can be no consumer choice, or there can be no choice about what gets made and how it gets made without workers' control, right? At the end of the day, we're choosing between options set by people whose interests are just to make as much money as possible, right? We're never going to have a properly environmentally friendly option because it's not going to be profitable. And also this idea that, like, individuals, or what, like, if we all just make individual change, 100 corporations currently account for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. So the idea that, like, yeah, if we just expropriate those countries, if we just take workers' control, have the workers take control of those companies and plan them in a way that is more environmentally conscious, that would be much more useful. And so we've also seen, this idea of, okay, so it's not individuals then, we need large-scale, environmentally friendly green development, right? And so things like the Green New Deal, right? This idea of, like, the government will invest in environmentally friendly projects, in like green infrastructure, in renewable energy, things like this. And this will sort of stimulate the economy. There's sort of Keynesianism. There's this idea that, like, oh, we'll spend money and that will stimulate the economy.
10 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, and then we'll have more environmentally friendly infrastructure or renewable energy. The problem here is that governments have no money of their own, right? All of the money that a government has comes either from borrowing from other governments, essentially, or from things like the International Monetary Fund, which is essentially the same thing. Printing, which sort of isn't, you can't just print loads of money, or through taxation, which is what eventually will come down to at the end of the day, is all of these projects, who's going to pay for them? The working class is going to end up paying for them. It's a sort of similar thing as before, where it's making the working class pay for the crisis of capitalism, right? Yeah, and things, sort of things like carbon taxes, right, or fuel taxes, that basically pull money, like basically disincentivize polluting activities. The largest companies, already don't pay tax, and this will always hit the poorest, or the petty bourgeois, or the workers. And a good example of this is in France, the Gilets jaunes. That protest was started after Macron tried to impose a fuel tax, or to raise the fuel tax, I think. That was there, and because that was squeezing the people who just needed that, who needed fuel to live their lives. It's not productive to do things like that. Yeah, and so we've come to this idea that, like, the masses need to be involved within any movement like this, and so we've seen, like, large-scale activism, basically. Like, this is because of its sort of global nature as well, of this crisis, global warming. People from all around the world, like, this is an issue that everyone can sort of link up with. But historically, like, this movement has had fairly low successes, like not much success, because of its hesitancy to sort of link up with the labour movement, essentially. So what we see in climate activism is a lot of things like publicity stunts, so like getting arrested or things like that, or doing things that essentially antagonize the masses or antagonize the workers. So, like, a good example of this is Insulate Britain again. Their idea of that we need to insulate the houses in this country is all well and good, but they chose to go about raising awareness for this by blocking the M25 and preventing loads of people from getting to work. And so, yeah, it's a sort of strange idea that the way to get people to notice that the planet is dying is to ruin their day, essentially, or to make life as difficult as possible for them. And that way they'll wake up and start doing things that we want them to do. It's actually very similar to what we talked about last week with the Russian sanctions. The sort of justification for that is saying, like, oh, we need to impose sanctions on Russia so that the people of Russia will rise up against Putin, right? Which is obviously nonsense, because that's just fuel on the fire of national. In the same way that, like, if you're an activist and you're getting yourself arrested and causing traffic, that's not something that people are going to want to join in with, in any case. Yeah, and so ultimately what this boils down to, these sorts of tactics, they boil down to a sort of desperation, which, I mean, is caused by the fact that we don't have much time left, but that means all the more that we can't afford to do things that aren't productive, that aren't useful, and also a complete lack of faith in the working class. a lack of faith in the working class don't really care about climate change really, and unless we do something, to shake them up, nothing's going to happen. And it's just completely not true. Like the only way, essentially, this is what it boils down to. The only way to fight for climate change is to get the organised working class involved in the organisation and planning of society, in the restructuring of society. A really good example of this is the Lucas Plan. The Lucas Plan was in the 1970s. Essentially, Lucas Aerospace was a weapons company, and the workers of that company basically got together and planned an alternative production plan. Essentially, they said, right, so we've got all these workers, and we've got all this, we've got these facilities. Here's how we could use all of this stuff and retrain our workers to, instead of making missiles, make kidney dialysis machines, high-tech medical equipment, things that are actually going to be productive towards society instead of used to sort of blow things up, right? So workers are entirely, they did this off their own. Workers are entirely capable of doing, of planning society in a way that is logical and rational, right, and is actually helpful. It's not, so this idea that the working class is too stupid to actually plan things is completely wrong. And so, at the end of the day, socialism is the only solution, because for example, this idea of where's the money going to come from to pay for all of this green infrastructure? Well, there's loads of money sitting in the banks at the moment that the capitalists aren't using to invest in anything, right? Capitalists haven't been productively investing in society really for ages now, right? They just gamble their money on the stock market or whatever new fad, or cryptocurrency or NFT, whatever. It's not incredibly important, but either they'll just let it sit there in their bank account and accrue interest, but there's no real productive investment in society anymore. And so we take that money from them. That money was gathered from the productive work of our society, right? We expropriate the banks. We expropriate the construction companies. We expropriate the transport companies. We take control of the levers of society in a democratic socialist revolution, basically. And in this way, we're able to plan society in a way that we don't have to sort of squeeze our consumption. We don't have to sort of tighten our belts, right? Everything, the science and technology already exists for us to have the same quality of living, or better, a better quality of living, with much less, with a much smaller effect on the climate. But at the end of the day, you need ownership. You can't plan what you don't control, and you can't control what you don't own. And so you need working class ownership over society. And ultimately, the ruling class, the capitalist class, will never be convinced to act, right? It's taken them this long to even start pretending to do stuff, right? And we're tobogganing towards disaster at the moment. And so, so we as sort of the organised working class have to take control of society, because the capitalist class are not fit to run society. They're going to destroy the world. And so to do this, we need a revolutionary socialist organisation to do this as well, which is what we're trying to build a socialist appeal. We're trying to be a socialist appeal. But so this is essentially the only way to prevent a climate crisis.